The 47th disruptor bolt was supposed to turn the Velsari heir apparent to ash. It struck the human instead, a rumpled diplomatic tunic smoldering over a kinetic dispersal mesh. The kill squad laughed. They had dispatched her elite guards in seconds. Then the smoke cleared. Sergeant Marcus Cole rose from the scorched deck, a single trickle of blood running from his nose. He didn't draw a weapon. He walked. Through the acrid haze, his eyes holding the flat patience of a species that evolved on a world where lethal trauma is just Tuesday. The assassins froze. They had no reference for something that simply refused to die. That moment inside a Velsari maintenance tunnel didn't just save a princess. It forced every galactic intelligence agency to confront an uncomfortable truth. Humanity doesn't need better weapons. Its biology already treats lethal force as a mild inconvenience. The question racing through every alien command center: if one human bodyguard can walk through 47 bolts and dismantle a kill squad barehanded, what happens when the rest of the species decides they aren't just protecting diplomats anymore? The Velsari Dominion had spent centuries perfecting the art of political neutralization. They didn't wage wars of attrition. They removed heirs. Quietly, surgically, and with a level of bureaucratic precision that made their kill squads the most feared contractors in the Orion Spur. Princess Lyra was the last thread holding a fragile peace coalition together. Her death would plunge 6 border systems into immediate succession chaos, and the syndicate that hired the assassins had already priced the ensuing resource grabs. The hit was planned down to the millisecond. The maintenance tunnel beneath the neutral diplomatic station was an engineering oversight that took 3 months of bribes to isolate. 47 disruptor bolts was the calculated overkill a Velsari Archon required for a direct assassination, not because of the human. The human was listed as a ceremonial attachment, Sergeant Marcus Cole, attached to the heir's detail for cultural exchange purposes. No threat rating, no known augmentations. Just a tall frame in an ill-fitting diplomatic tunic with no visible weaponry beyond a ceremonial sidearm. The kill team's pointman actually filed a complaint about wasting ammunition. Sergeant Cole was not ceremonial. He was a 20-year veteran of the Terran Guard's Kinetic Absorption Research Division, colloquially known as the Walking Wall Program. The mesh beneath his tunic was a 7th-generation dispersal lattice, originally designed to protect miners during asteroid fragmentation accidents. When Cole volunteered for the diplomatic corps, he was assigned one of 12 prototype weaves that converted kinetic energy into thermal bleed-off along a graphene-titanium matrix. The mesh could absorb up to 93,000 joules of impact force per square centimeter before structural fatigue. A disruptor bolt delivered roughly 2,000 joules. The assassins had brought enough firepower to vaporize 3 armored Velsari elites. They had not brought enough to inconvenience Cole. The moment the first bolt struck his chest, Cole's training overrode instinct. He didn't dodge. He pivoted into the barrage, using his body as a shield to cover the princess, and counted impacts. The mesh went critical after the 11th shot, the heat bleeding through the tunic's lining and singing his undershirt, but the lattice held. The 23rd bolt struck his left shoulder, dislocating the joint with a wet pop. The 35th cracked 2 ribs despite the energy redistribution. At 47, the mesh was nearly slag, the ceramic plates underneath glowing a dull orange, and a thin vessel in his nasal cavity had ruptured from the pressure wave. That was the blood the assassins saw. They thought it was a mortal wound. They had never encountered a species whose adrenal system turns pain into fuel. The kill squad's pointman lowered his weapon and laughed, a clicking, reverberating sound that echoed through the tunnel. He turned to his handler to confirm elimination. The laugh died in his throat when the smoke twisted. A shape moved, slow, deliberate, not stumbling, walking. The human silhouette straightened, steam rising from his shoulders, and behind the haze, 2 irises glowed with the reflected emergency lighting of the corridor. The pointman fired again, point blank, a 48th bolt straight into the silhouette's outstretched hand. The hand closed around the muzzle. The disruptor crumpled with a shriek of tortured alloy, And for the first time in Velsari military history, a kill squad experienced what humans call a fight response in close quarters. The tunnel cameras captured everything. Station security would later describe the next 90 seconds as a biological lesson no alien species ever wanted to learn firsthand. The next 90 seconds were recorded by 17 separate corridor cameras. What follows is a summary of the footage that station security later classified as a bioweapon stress test nobody asked for. Cole did not retreat behind the slagged remains of his cover. He closed the distance to the point man in 4 strides, each step leaving a faint thermal imprint on the deck plating. The point man, a 7-foot Velsari mercenary with a reinforced endoskeleton, tried to raise a second disruptor. Cole's left hand, the one with the dislocated shoulder, swung upward in a motion that should have been impossible. The palm caught the mercenary's wrist, and the kinetic mesh transferred the remaining residual charge directly into the alien's carpal plating, shattering it. The disruptor clattered away. Cole's right hand closed around the mercenary's throat, and with a single compression that bent the armored collar inward, the point man went limp. The rest of the squad reacted in the way apex predators react when a prey animal suddenly becomes the threat. They fired. Cole used the point man's body as a shield for the first 6 bolts, then discarded it and drove his knee through the secondary shooter's midsection, folding a reinforced thoracic cage in half. The third assassin managed to draw a vibroblade. Cole allowed the blade to embed itself in the meat of his forearm, then twisted, snapping the blade at the hilt before using the broken grip to deliver a blow to the attacker's temple. By the time station security teams reached the tunnel, the corridor was a tableau of broken armor, scorched plating, and one very exhausted human leaning against a bulkhead, while Princess Lyra calmly pressed a medical patch to his cheek. She had not been touched. The footage should have been sealed. Instead, a junior logistics officer on the diplomatic station sold it to a data broker within 4 hours. By the time the Terran Guard realized what had happened, the entire incident was circulating through 17 galactic networks under titles that roughly translated to "the species that won't die." In the Velsari Dominion, the High Archon's War Council convened in emergency session and spent the first 10 minutes watching the footage in absolute silence. There is a specific sound that a disruptor bolt makes when it fails to kill something. The Council heard it 48 times. The syndicate that financed the assassination was less stunned and significantly more furious. They had paid for a clean removal, not a species-wide public relations catastrophe. The contract had a failure clause, and the clause activated the moment the princess stepped off the station alive. Within 12 hours, every bounty broker from the core worlds to the fringe had a new priority contract. Sergeant Marcus Cole, dead or alive, with a sum so large that 3 separate mercenary guilds temporarily suspended their ongoing wars to discuss a joint venture. The galactic underworld had just learned that humans could be bought. What it did not yet understand was that some humans could not be killed. But here is the thing that nobody in the immediate aftermath paused to ask. Why was Sergeant Marcus Cole, a highly specialized Terran Guard operative with a prototype dispersal mesh, assigned to a low-profile diplomatic shuttle run in a neutral sector with no prior threat assessment? The assignment came directly from the Terran Guard's counterintelligence division, buried under a cultural exchange designation that no one bothered to audit. Cole's presence was not a coincidence. It was a mandate. And the architects of that mandate were about to discover that their field test had triggered a reaction far beyond what any simulation had predicted. Because while the galactic networks were still dissecting the footage frame by frame, a separate and much quieter signal was being picked up by deep space listening posts on the edge of the human coalition's border. A Velsari battle fleet, previously believed to be stationed around a garrison world, had gone dark 3 days earlier. And its last known trajectory placed it on a direct course for the diplomatic station where a princess had just survived an assassination and a human had just rewritten the biological definition of the word threat. The signal came coded with a single instruction: sanitize the witness. The listening post was a Terran installation buried inside a hollowed-out comet on the edge of Sector 9, staffed by a crew of 12 analysts who had spent the last 6 months compiling sensor logs about natural subspace chatter. When the Velsari battle fleet's transmission was intercepted, the shift supervisor, a woman named Lieutenant Chen, read the decryption 3 times before she accepted that the words "sanitize the witness" were not a mistranslation. The fleet was no longer dark. It had activated its full sensor array and was burning hard toward the diplomatic station, an unarmed neutral hub whose only strategic value was that it currently housed a princess, a human prototype, and the single most embarrassing security leak in Velsari history. Chen sent an urgent flash to Terran Command. The response came back in under 2 minutes, which was how she knew someone had been expecting this. The orders were tight and terrifying. Do not intercept. Do not warn the station. Observe and record. Whoever was making decisions on Earth had already decided that the diplomatic station was an acceptable loss. Chen flagged the file with a whistleblower tag and sent a parallel transmission to the station's encrypted emergency channel. It would arrive approximately 18 minutes before the Velsari Vanguard. The lieutenant then sat down at her console and began to write her resignation letter in longhand, because some things could not be entered into an official log. On the station, Princess Lyra was in the medical bay having the last of the disruptor residue flushed from her skin when the station chief of security, a tired Velsari Orlian hybrid named Torin, burst through the doors holding a data slate that was vibrating with an unscheduled message from a source he did not recognize. He read the contents aloud. The princess did not panic. She had been raised in a court where survival meant calculating probabilities while people were still in the room. She asked Torin for 3 things: a full station schematic, the override codes for the civilian evacuation pods, and Sergeant Cole. Cole was in the armory, having just finished resetting his own dislocated shoulder against a wall. The pain had settled into a background hum that his training told him was about 72 hours from becoming a real problem. He was counting ammunition for the station's limited kinetic stockpile when the princess walked in. She told him about the fleet. She told him about the listening post. Then she told him that the bounty contracts had gone live across 17 networks and that the first mercenary ships were already changing course. Cole listened, loaded a slug into the chamber of a heavy repeater and said, "3-sided fight on a station with no shields and a reactor from the last century. This is exactly the kind of assignment they don't put in the recruitment brochure." He then told her what he had not told anyone since the tunnel. His deployment was not cultural exchange. It was Operation Godhammer, a Terran Guard counterintelligence program designed to field-test human survivability by planting high-value assets in assassination corridors and observing the fallout. The program's architects wanted to know if a single human could destabilize an entire enemy command structure just by refusing to die. The data from the tunnel had already been streamed back to the Guard's analysis wing. The Velsari fleet's response was not a contingency. It was the planned outcome. Princess Lyra said nothing for a long moment. Then she asked, "Did you know?" Cole met her eyes. "I knew I was a target. I didn't know they'd sacrifice a station to prove the point." The sabotage of the reactor was discovered 12 minutes later. A junior technician, responding to a pressure alarm in the coolant loop, found a shaped charge wired into the primary magnetic containment field. The charge was Velsari military issue, planted by a sleeper agent who had been on the station for 11 months. The agent was found 6 corridors away, dead from a self-administered neurotoxin. The reactor was not yet offline, but the containment field was degrading at a rate that would trigger an automatic emergency shutdown in just under 4 hours. Without main power, the station's point defense turrets would go dark. The evacuation pods could not launch without guidance thrusters. The station would become a floating coffin. That was when the first mercenary ship docked. It was a converted freighter called the Black Scale, carrying a crew of crate mercenaries who specialized in close-quarters extraction. They had paid a mid-level station administrator for a hangar access code, and were storming the docking ring before Torrens security teams had even finished sealing the blast doors. The fight in the ring was brief and brutal. Cole, carrying the heavy repeater and moving with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had already passed his pain threshold, cut through the first wave in under 3 minutes. He used the mercenaries' own breaching charges to collapse the access corridor, buying the station an additional 90 minutes before the next wave could force entry. But the Velsari fleet was still coming. Princess Lyra, in the command center, pulled up the long-range sensor feed. 12 capital ships. Full complement of troop transports. Enough firepower to reduce the station to a cooling debris field in 60 seconds. She ran the numbers and concluded that the only scenario in which anyone survived was one where the fleet entered the station's minimum safe zone, at which point the reactor's emergency overload could be used as a directed blast. The plan was insane. It required someone to manually bypass the safeties at the core while the station was under assault. Cole, when informed of the plan, simply asked what the trigger mechanism would be. The princess told him it was a manual relay junction that could only be accessed from the engineering deck, which was currently on the wrong side of a breaching corridor. He pulled the repeater's carrying strap over his shoulder, cracked his neck, and walked toward the door. The countdown had already begun. The engineering deck was a cathedral of dying light. Emergency strobing washed the maintenance gantries in pulses of amber and red, and the station's failing reactor bled a low-frequency hum that climbed through the deck plates and into Cole's rib cage. He moved through the smoke-filled access shafts with the quiet economy of a man who had spent 2 decades learning that speed mattered less than timing. The mercenary squads had broken through 2 more airlocks by the time he reached the main coolant junction, and Torrens security teams were falling back toward the civilian shelters, laying down covering fire with whatever they had left. Cole did not turn back. The princess was on the command deck, routing auxiliary power to the point defense grid for one last delaying barrage, and she needed him to be exactly where the schematics said the manual relay was. The junction was located behind a collapsed bulkhead, pinned under 3 tons of warped alloy that a maintenance drone had failed to clear 5 years ago. Cole braced his back against the corridor wall, dug his heels into the grated floor, and pushed with the kind of force that separates ligaments from bone. The bulkhead shifted. The gap was barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, but Cole had never been particularly large for a human, and his shoulder had already dislocated once today, so the pain was an old friend. He slipped inside, dragging the heavy repeater behind him, and found the relay console exactly where the princess had described. A manual trigger, an analog dial from a previous generation of station engineering, and a dead man switch that required continuous pressure to prime the overload sequence. The fleet arrived 3 minutes later. The capital ships dropped out of subspace in a tight formation, their weapons already hot and locking onto the station's reactor signature. In the command center, Princess Lyra watched the tactical display fill with hostile icons and made a choice that she had been trained to make since childhood. She opened a direct channel to the Velsari fleet commander on an unencrypted frequency and began to negotiate, not to surrender, to stall. She offered a formal apology, a diplomatic resolution, a summit. She offered anything that would keep the commander talking for the next 20 minutes while a human sergeant crawled through smoking wreckage to arm a bomb the Velsari could not see on their scanners. Cole heard the first salvo impact the station's outer hull while he was still bypassing the safety regulators. The deck pitched, throwing him against the console, and the dead man's switch flickered amber. He caught it with his elbow, held it down, and kept working. The console was built for a 4-armed Aurelian technician, and half the interfaces were in a dialect that translated poorly. But Cole had been trained to operate alien systems under fire, because the walking wall program assumed its operatives would be the last thing standing in any room. He cross-wired the containment field's fail-safe into the auxiliary thrust control, creating a directional vent large enough to channel the full force of a reactor breach. It was inelegant. It would probably kill him. It would definitely vaporize the Velsari Vanguard. The fleet commander's voice finally cut through Lyra's diplomatic overtures with a single sentence. "Your stalling is noted, Princess. The sanitization proceeds." The 12 capital ships opened fire simultaneously, but they fired on the station's point defense grid, which Lyra had rerouted to present a false thermal signature on the far side of the dock. The first barrage struck empty hangar space, buying Cole another 90 seconds. He used them to strip the shielding from the relay junction, exposing the raw charge conduit that would feed the overload. Then he did something the engineers had not designed for. He sat down, braced his foot against the dead man's switch to hold it in place, and aimed the heavy repeater at the door. Because the screaming from the corridor told him the mercenaries had finally found the right maintenance shaft. The crate squad that breached the junction was 6 strong. They carried pulse lances designed for void combat. They were expecting a wounded station and maybe a few terrified civilians. What they found was a human seated cross-legged at a jury-rigged bomb, holding a slug thrower with the calm of a man who had already calculated his own survival odds and found them irrelevant. Cole killed the first 3 with single shots to the center mass, the depleted uranium slugs cracking their armor like eggshells. The 4th threw a plasma grenade. Cole caught it and threw it back. The 5th and 6th tried to retreat, but the shaft behind them had collapsed under the fleet's bombardment, and Cole had already chambered the next 2 rounds. Above them, the Velsari fleet adjusted its formation for a direct core strike. The reactor's automatic emergency shutdown sequence was overridden by Cole's bypass, and the containment field began a controlled collapse that vented superheated plasma directly into the magnetic funnel he had jury-rigged. The engineers who would later review the telemetry would call it the most terrifyingly efficient use of a dying reactor in human history. Cole, still holding the dead man's switch with his foot, reached up and pulled the manual release. The station shuddered. A lance of white-hot energy, concentrated by the auxiliary thrust control, shot from the far side of the station and sliced through the Velsari flagship's forward batteries like a surgical laser. The ship did not explode. It simply stopped transmitting. Its escort vessels scattered, their formation broken, and the bombardment ceased. In the command center, Lyra watched the tactical display clear and gave a single order: "Stand down, point defense. Evacuation pods are green." Torin began pulling his security teams back to the hangars. The remaining mercenary squads, seeing the fleet rout and their employer effectively gone, surrendered rather than face whatever had just happened. And on the engineering deck, Cole released the dead man's switch, waited for the emergency venting cycle to complete, and then walked out through the same shaft he had crawled through, his repeater empty and his uniform now more burned scar than fabric. He found the princess in the hangar, coordinating the last of the civilian departures, and handed her the charred relay key. "Next time," he said, "maybe ask for a volunteer." The aftermath was not quiet. The footage from the tunnel, combined with the sensor logs from the fleet engagement, was eventually declassified by a Terran Guard review board that decided the best deterrent was public knowledge. The Velsari Dominion issued a formal apology and recalled its remaining fleet elements from the Orion Spur. The syndicate that had placed the bounty declared bankruptcy and dissolved within a month. And Operation God Hammer, the program that had planted a human bodyguard in a death corridor to see what would happen, was suddenly the most overfunded division in Coalition history. But the final surprising detail, the one that historian analysts would argue about for decades, was not about Cole at all. It was about the princess. 6 months after the incident, Princess Lyra announced a personal initiative. Every Velsari diplomatic vessel would henceforth carry at least one human escort, not as a guard, but as a witness. She had learned that survival against all odds was not just a human trait. It was a statement, and she intended to make sure the rest of the galaxy could never forget what one human looked like walking through smoke. Cole was reassigned to a quiet advisory post. He spent the rest of his career training the first generation of alien-tolerant bodyguards, and when asked about the 47 bolts, he would just shrug and say, "You take the hits that are coming, and you keep walking." The galaxy, for the first time in its long history, began to believe that rule might just be universal. That rule, take the hits that are coming and keep walking, had always been human folklore, whispered in the barracks of the Terran Guard and laughed off by species who assumed biology was the ceiling. After one man rose from 47 point-blank bolts, folklore became the single most terrifying strategic fact in the Orion Spur. Every military doctrine in the galaxy was quietly rewritten, not to counter human weapons, but to account for the possibility that the human would simply refuse to go down. The Velsari battle fleet's retreat was not a tactical defeat. It was a philosophical collapse. They had prepared for war. They had not prepared for a species that treats extreme trauma as a negotiation. But the lingering question, the one that still keeps intelligence analysts awake 30 years later, has nothing to do with Cole's mesh or his training. It is this: how many more humans like him are there? The Walking Wall program was classified for nearly a decade after the incident, and when the details finally leaked, it turned out Cole was not the exception. He was the prototype. 100 others had already been recruited, trained, and augmented with the same lattice tech. If one human bodyguard could destabilize an entire dominion and break a mercenary syndicate's financial back, what happens when 1,000 of them stop guarding diplomats and start walking forward? The galaxy has not yet asked humanity that question out loud. It is too afraid of the answer. Thanks for watching this deep dive into the day humanity rewrote the biology of combat. If this story sparked something in you, that strange, stubborn pride in what we are, drop a like, share it with someone who needs to remember why humans endure, and subscribe so you never miss the next chapter from the edge of known space. We'll be here when the next impossible moment hits, and we'll be walking through the smoke.